On a far-off world called Zerath, a fierce war was raging. The Selthar, an ancient and powerful alien race, had conquered many planets, and now their eyes were set on Earth. To them, humans were nothing more than fragile creatures, easy to crush beneath their heels. Their advanced technology, unmatched strength, and centuries of war experience had led them to believe that humans were delicate, barely surviving in the vast galaxy. Circa was one of the Zelthar's finest warriors, tall, muscular, and scarred from years of battle. She was the very picture of strength. Her people had been battling human forces for months now, crushing human resistance at every turn. She saw the humans as weak, their technology primitive, and their bodies easily broken. The Zelthar were the dominant force in the universe, and Circa was proud to fight for them. Today, she stood on the edge of a battlefield, watching as her fellow soldiers rounded up a small group of human survivors. Their weapons were no match for the Zelthar's firepower, and their bodies were easily broken by the brutal alien warriors. One soldier, a human male, was dragged before Circa, his face bloodied and bruised from the fight. "Take him to the interrogation chamber," Circa ordered, her voice cold and commanding. She had seen hundreds of humans captured, and none of them had ever shown anything more than fear. But as the soldier was shoved to his knees before her, something about him caught her attention. His eyes were wide with pain, but there was something else, something that sparked an unfamiliar emotion in Circa. It was not fear, it was defiance. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice low. The human, despite the bruises and cuts that marred his face, looked up at her, his lips curled into a small, defiant smile. "My name is Jackson," he said through gritted teeth, "and I'll never give up." Circa frowned. This was unusual. Most humans, when caught, begged for their lives. They pleaded, they cried, and they begged for mercy. But not this one. He seemed unshaken, as though he had already accepted his fate, and yet there was an odd energy about him, something that piqued Circa's interest. "You think you can resist?" she asked, her voice filled with disdain. "Your kind is fragile. You can't withstand the power of the Zelthar." Jackson's smile widened despite the pain. "You'll see," he said quietly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. Circa narrowed her eyes. Humans were weak, she thought. They were easily broken, easily conquered. She had seen it all before. There was no power in their resistance, no strength in their spirit. They would crumble under the weight of the Zelthar, but something about Jackson made her pause. His confidence, even in the face of certain death, stirred something in Circa. It wasn't fear or anger. No, it was curiosity. The soldiers hauled Jackson away, dragging him through the mud toward the interrogation chamber. Circa followed, still lost in thought. Lost in, why was this human different? What made him so calm, so unafraid? It was as if he knew something she didn't. Inside the chamber, Jackson was shackled to a metal table. Circa stood at the entrance, watching as the interrogators began their work. They were ruthless, using every method they knew to break him. But Jackson didn't flinch. He took every blow, every sharp word, with the same unwavering determination. Hours passed, and Circa remained by the door, her curiosity growing with each passing moment. She had witnessed countless interrogations before, but none like this. The humans would scream, beg, or faint from the pain. But Jackson, he remained silent, almost as if he were immune to the torture. And then, something happened that Circa had never seen before. Jackson's wounds began to heal before her eyes. It started with a small cut on his arm, which began to close up, the flesh knitting itself back together. Then, the bruises on his face faded as if the damage had never been done. Circa blinked in disbelief. She had seen many things in her life, but never anything like this. The human's body was regenerating at an incredible rate. The blood, the injuries, they were disappearing. It was as though his body was fighting against the very laws of biology. "Impossible," Circa whispered to herself. She stepped closer, her eyes wide. This human was no longer just a prisoner. He was something far more extraordinary than she had ever imagined. Jackson looked up at her as though he knew she was watching. His defiant smile returned. "I told you," he said, his voice steady. "Humans are stronger than you think." Circa's mind raced. She had always thought of humans as delicate, as creatures too weak to survive the galaxy. But this was different. She had never seen anything like it before. How could a species so fragile possess such strength? How could their bodies heal in such a way that defied the very nature of their existence? She stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to look away. Jackson's self-regeneration was nothing short of miraculous, and it shook everything she had ever believed. This was no ordinary human, and perhaps, just perhaps, humans weren't as delicate as the Zelthar had thought. Circa turned and walked away from the chamber, her mind spinning. She had witnessed something that could change the course of the war, something that could shift the balance of power between the Zelthar and humanity. She didn't know it yet, but this encounter would change her life forever. Circa walked away from the interrogation room, her mind still racing with the incredible sight she had just witnessed. She couldn't shake the image of Jackson's injuries healing right before her eyes. It defied all logic. It was as though his body was rejecting the wounds, forcing itself to heal against nature's laws. She had never seen anything like it before, not in all her years of battle and observation. The more Circa thought about it, the more her curiosity grew. Humans, fragile, weak, and easily destroyed. How could one of them possess such an incredible ability? Her people had conquered countless worlds, wiping out species far stronger than humans. And yet, here was Jackson, healing from the injuries. That would have killed any other creature. She couldn't help but wonder what made him so different. What kind of power lay hidden inside a human's body? Circa had heard rumors among her people of human warriors who could perform incredible feats. Some spoke of them surviving in the harshest environments. Others whispered of them surviving wounds that would have instantly killed any other species. But Circa had always dismissed these stories. The idea of humans being more than just fragile, weak creatures was laughable. Until now. Her thoughts were interrupted when a voice called out to her. "Circa, we need you back on the front line." It was her commander Kor, a seasoned Zelthar officer. He had been overseeing the war effort on Earth, and his orders were always final. Circa had fought alongside him for years, and her loyalty to him was unquestionable. But today something felt different. She wasn't sure if it was the war, the constant fighting, or the strange encounter with Jackson, but she felt a disconnect. She felt as though something had changed inside her, something she couldn't explain. "I'll be there in a moment," Circa replied, her voice flat. Kor eyed her carefully, sensing the shift in her demeanor. "Everything all right, Circa?" Circa hesitated for a moment. Her mind was still on Jackson, on the way he had healed, the way his body seemed to fight back against every injury. She wasn't sure how to explain it. There was something about him that had unsettled her, and she couldn't put her finger on it. "Just thinking," Circa said, her voice distant. "I'll join you shortly." Kor gave her a suspicious look but said nothing more. He turned and walked away, leaving Circa alone in the corridor. Her mind wandered back to Jackson. What was his secret? How could a human possess such an extraordinary ability? She couldn't shake the thought. She needed to know more. The next few hours were a blur. Circa fought with her comrades on the front lines, leading attacks against human settlements, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Her heart wasn't in the battle. She found herself thinking about Jackson and the strange power he had displayed. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his body healing, the blood flowing back into his skin, the bruises vanishing before her eyes. Later that night, after the battle had ended, Circa found herself back in the prisoner holding area. The humans were locked away in cells awaiting their fate. Some had already been interrogated, while others, like Jackson, were still being monitored. Circa walked past the rows of cells, her eyes searching for him. She finally found him in the farthest corner of the holding area. Jackson sat on the cold metal floor, his back against the wall, his hands resting calmly on his knees. He looked no different from the last time she saw him, his face bruised but somehow still serene. He didn't seem to notice her approach, but Circa felt an odd sense of urgency inside her, as though she had to see him again. "Jackson," she said, her voice softer than she intended. His eyes slowly lifted to meet hers. Despite the pain and the exhaustion that were written on his face, there was something undeniably calm in his gaze, as if nothing could rattle him, no matter how much he had been through. "Circa," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "Back. Again?" Circa frowned. "I need to understand what happened to you. How did you heal? It's not normal." Jackson's eyes flickered with something, perhaps amusement or something deeper, something Circa couldn't quite understand. "It's just what humans do," he said quietly. "We survive no matter what." Circa's brows furrowed. She had seen humans survive before, of course. They had fought bravely, but they were still fragile. Their bodies couldn't withstand the kinds of injuries the Zelthar could endure. So how was it possible for Jackson to do what he had done? "This healing," she pressed. "I've never seen anything like it. How can you do that?" Jackson shrugged, though the action seemed almost casual, as if he didn't fully grasp the depth of her confusion. "It's a gift, I guess," he said, his voice low. "A human thing. I can't explain it, but it's been with me for as long as I can remember." Circa stood there speechless for a moment, trying to make sense of his words. Could it really be something that simple? Could it be true that humans were capable of such power without even knowing it? The thought seemed impossible, but the more Circa considered it, the more it made sense. She had seen this man endure pain that would have broken any other species, only to recover and stand tall once again. There had to be more to it than just survival. There had to be a deeper force at work inside him, inside humans. She was beginning to realize that the humans weren't as fragile as she had always believed. In fact, they were far stronger than anyone could have imagined. Circa's mind raced as she processed the information. She had been taught to believe that the Zelthar were the strongest, the most powerful beings in the universe. But here, in front of her, was a human who defied every law of biology, a human who was more than just a survivor. Jackson was something else, something more. "You're different," Circa said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't understand." Jackson looked at her and smiled, his expression soft. "Maybe you will one day," he said. "Maybe you'll see what humans are really capable of." Circa stared at him, her thoughts spinning. She didn't know what to make of what he had said. She only knew one thing for certain: humans were far stronger than she had ever given them credit for. And Jackson, the human she had captured, was proof of that. The next few days passed in a blur for Circa. She couldn't stop thinking about Jackson and the strange ability he had shown. It was something beyond her understanding. Despite her many years of training and the countless battles she had fought, Circa had never encountered anything like what she had witnessed. She had watched Jackson endure unimaginable pain, yet his body healed as if it was never injured in the first place. It was a mystery that gnawed at her thoughts, and no matter how hard she tried to focus on the war and her duties, Jackson's ability was always in the back of her mind. In her rare moments of solitude, Circa found herself retracing her steps, recalling the look in Jackson's eyes when he had healed. There was a quiet strength in him, a determination that felt almost otherworldly. She had seen many warriors, both alien and human, but none like him. None who could shrug off pain so easily, as if their body had a mind of its own. It was then that Circa made a decision. If she wanted to understand this strange power, she would have to see it again, and she would have to test it. Circa made her way to the holding area, where Jackson was kept under guard. She knew the commander would be angry with her for going there, but at that moment nothing else mattered. Her curiosity was far too great. She needed answers. As she entered the cell block, she spotted Jackson sitting in the far corner of his cell. He was alone, just as he had been the last time she saw him. His posture was relaxed, though his eyes were sharp and aware. The moment he saw her, a knowing smile crossed his face. "Back again?" Jackson asked. His voice was steady, but there was a trace of amusement in it. He didn't seem afraid, even though Circa was one of the most feared warriors in the galaxy. "I need to see something," Circa said, her voice firm, though her heart raced with anticipation. "You healed before. I need to know if it happens." "Again?" Jackson raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by her request. "What exactly do you want me to do?" Circa didn't answer immediately. She stepped closer to the bars of the cell and took a long, hard look at him. She had seen his strength, his defiance, but now she was about to test it. She had no idea if this would work, or if it would reveal more than she wanted to know, but she couldn't back down now. "I want you to show me," she said simply. "I want you to show me that you can heal, that you can survive what no one else could." Jackson remained silent for a moment, considering her words. Then, without warning, he stood up and walked toward the bars. He didn't ask why or demand anything in return. He simply obeyed. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll show you." Circa stepped back, giving him space. She wasn't sure how this would play out, but she was determined to see it through. She motioned to the guards standing nearby. They seemed confused but didn't question her. The guards had grown accustomed to her strange behavior, though they still didn't understand why she showed so much interest in one human prisoner. With a quick nod, Circa ordered one of the guards to throw a small, sharp blade at Jackson. It was a test, a way to see if he truly could heal as quickly as he claimed. The blade was meant to wound him, but it was not meant to kill. She had to see what happened when the damage was done. Jackson didn't flinch as the blade soared through the air. It struck him in the shoulder, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, to Circa's astonishment, the wound began to close up. The blood stopped flowing and the skin started to knit together, as if the injury had never existed in the first place. Circa took a step forward, her eyes wide in disbelief. She had seen countless injuries both among her own people and the humans they fought, but nothing like this. The wound had been deep, and yet it was vanishing before her eyes. "That's impossible," she whispered, unable to hide the awe in her voice. Jackson didn't respond at first. He simply stood there, watching her reaction. The healing was quick, but it was not instantaneous. It was as if his body was adjusting to the injury, fighting back against the damage, forcing itself to recover. Slowly but surely the wound vanished completely, leaving no trace that it had ever been there. Circa stepped closer, reaching out as if to touch the spot where the blade had struck. It was as though the injury had never existed. The skin was smooth, undamaged. She could hardly believe it. "How?" she finally managed to ask, her voice filled with awe. Jackson looked at her, his expression calm but serious. "I don't know. It's just something I've always been able to do." Circa stared at him, her mind racing. There had to be more to it than just some innate ability. Humans weren't supposed to heal like this. Their bodies weren't designed for such recovery. But Jackson had proven otherwise. He had shown her a power that defied everything she knew. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Circa asked, her voice softer now. "Why didn't you use this ability to defeat us?" Jackson smiled, though there was no humor in it. "I didn't know I could do it until I was pushed to my limit. And even then, I didn't want to use it against you." Circa blinked, a little taken aback by his words. She had expected him to fight back, to boast about his ability. But instead he seemed humble, almost regretful. She had underestimated him. The strength of a warrior was not just in their abilities, but in their restraint, their wisdom. "Humans are strong," Circa said quietly, more to herself than to Jackson. "I didn't understand that before." Jackson looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You still think we're weak?" Circa shook her head slowly. "No, not anymore." Jackson's smile returned, and for the first time, Circa found herself genuinely respecting him. He had proven something to her, something that made her reconsider everything she had believed about humans. For the first time in her life, Circa wasn't sure who the real enemy was. Circa couldn't shake the images from her mind. Jackson's healing, the way his wounds closed up so quickly, it haunted her thoughts. She couldn't stop replaying it over and over again. Every time she thought she had it figured out, something new about humans came to light that made her question everything she believed. Since their last encounter, Circa found herself returning to the prisoner holding area more often. She didn't fully understand why. Was it because of Jackson's ability? Or was it the way he looked at her, calm, unshaken, as if he had already seen the worst the universe had to offer? She didn't know, but she couldn't ignore the growing curiosity inside her. Jackson's defiance had turned into something more, a quiet, resilient strength that Circa couldn't help but respect. Despite being a prisoner of war, despite the way the Zelthar treated him and his people, he had never once begged for mercy. Even now, as he was kept in a cell like the others, he carried himself with dignity. That was something Circa had never seen in a human before. One evening, after another long day of battles and reports, Circa found herself once again standing outside Jackson's cell. The guards were busy, and no one noticed her approach. She stood there for a moment, watching him, wondering if he would look up. She had come to see if his healing power was something he could control. But now, she found herself simply watching him, waiting for something more. It was strange. Jackson was no longer just a human soldier. He was something else now. He was a symbol of the strength Circa had never thought possible in humanity. "You're back again," Jackson said, his voice calm, even with the quiet hint of amusement. Circa nodded, though she didn't speak right away. She was still processing everything, her mind racing with questions. She had always been taught to see humans as weak, to believe they had no place in the universe. But Jackson was different. He didn't fit her expectations. He didn't fit the stories the Zelthar had told her about the fragility of humanity. "Why don't you just fight back?" Circa asked suddenly, surprising herself with the question. She had been wondering about this for days. Why did Jackson hold back? Why didn't he use his power to fight the Zelthar, to stop them from capturing him and his people? Jackson looked at her thoughtfully, as if he was considering her question for the first time. He leaned back against the wall of his cell, his hands clasped behind his head. "We do fight back," he said, his voice low but firm. "But sometimes fighting doesn't mean using power. Sometimes it means surviving. Sometimes it means standing strong, even when the world is trying to crush you." Circa stared at him, her mind processing his words. She had fought countless battles, and she had always believed that strength meant crushing your enemy, showing no mercy. But Jackson's words were different. They weren't about strength in battle. They were about strength in perseverance, in survival. She could see now that Jackson's power wasn't just in his healing ability. It was in his spirit, his determination to stay alive, to keep going no matter what. "You're not like the others," Circa said quietly. "You're different." Jackson's gaze softened and he nodded. "I suppose that's true. But that's the thing about humans. We don't give up. No matter how many times we're knocked down, we keep getting back up." Circa felt something stir inside her. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't sympathy. It was respect. She had always been taught to see humans as fragile, to dismiss them as weak. But Jackson had shown her something she couldn't ignore, something she couldn't deny. Humans were strong, but in a way that was different from the Zelthar. They fought with their hearts, not just with their strength. And that made them dangerous in ways she hadn't fully understood. "You're a warrior, Jackson," Circa said, her voice quiet but filled with newfound respect. "In your own way, you're as strong as any Zelthar." Jackson smiled at her words, though his expression was not one of arrogance. It was a smile of understanding, as if he knew exactly what she meant. "I don't think I'm anything special," he said with a shrug, "but I do believe that we all have something inside us that keeps us going. That's what makes us strong." Circa stood there for a long moment, processing everything he had said. Jackson had given her something to think about, something that made her question everything she thought she knew about strength, about survival, about humanity. The next day, Circa found herself at the front lines once again. But this time, her mind wasn't focused on the battle. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Jackson, to the strength he had shown. And with each passing moment, she found herself questioning the war more and more. The Zelthar had always seen themselves, As the rulers of the galaxy, the strongest species in the universe. But what if they were wrong? What if there were other species like humans who had their own kind of strength? Strength that wasn't measured in power or technology, but in the will to survive. As the battle raged on, Circa's thoughts shifted. She was supposed to be leading the charge, striking fear into the hearts of the humans. But now all she could think about was Jackson and the lessons he had unwittingly taught her. The more she fought, the more she realized that something inside her was changing. She was beginning to see the humans in a new light, no longer as fragile beings to be destroyed, but as equals, as survivors, as warriors. That night, Circa stood before the commander, Kor, who was busy reviewing battle reports. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable. "Circa, how did the battle go?" he asked, not bothering to look up from the documents. Circa hesitated for a moment before speaking. "The humans. They're not as weak as we thought." Kor looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" "They fight in ways we don't understand," Circa said, her voice low but firm. "They fight with their hearts, not just their strength. And that makes them far more dangerous than we realize." Kor's expression turned serious. "You've been spending too much time with the prisoner, Circa. Don't forget who the enemy is." Circa met his gaze, her own, eyes filled with a new determination. "I haven't forgotten, but maybe it's time to." The tension on the battlefield had reached its peak. The war between the Zelthar and humans was intensifying, with each side fighting fiercely for control. The Zelthar had always assumed they would crush the humans with ease. Their advanced technology, strength, and battle tactics had made them nearly invincible. But now, after everything Circa had seen and learned, she wasn't so sure anymore. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jackson's face, the calm, steady look in his eyes as he had healed before her very eyes. She remembered his words. "We don't give up, no matter what." There was something in his unwavering determination that made Circa feel uneasy. The humans weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for something deeper, something the Zelthar had never truly understood. Circa had witnessed firsthand how powerful human resilience could be. But she had also witnessed something else. She had seen how far humans were willing to go to protect what they loved. She had seen their courage, their loyalty, and their refusal to give in to fear. She had been so focused on defeating them that she hadn't fully understood the strength that lay beneath their fragile-looking exteriors. The day of the final battle arrived. It was a decisive strike. Both sides knew that the outcome of this battle would determine the fate of the war. Circa's commanding officer, Kor, had ordered an all-out assault on a human stronghold. The humans had dug in deep, and the Zelthar forces were going to push them out, no matter the cost. Circa stood among her comrades, her mind elsewhere. The battlefield stretched out before her, but she could hardly focus on the enemy in front of her. Instead, her thoughts kept returning to Jackson. How could she be part of this fight? How could she continue to fight a species that had shown so much strength? She had already made up her mind. After the battle, she would have to leave. She couldn't continue this war, not after everything she had learned about humanity. But for now, there was no turning back. The battle was about to begin. Kor's voice cut through the air, commanding his soldiers to charge. The Zelthar forces advanced in a wave, their weapons raised, their battle cries filling the air. Circa stood still for a moment, taking in the sight. She had led battles like this before, and yet this time, something felt different. The human resistance wasn't as weak as she had thought. They were holding their ground, pushing back with surprising ferocity. "Circa!" Kor shouted, snapping her out of her thoughts. "Move forward! We need to break their defenses!" Circa nodded, her hand tightening around her weapon. She moved forward, leading the charge, but with every step her mind was filled with doubt. What was she fighting for? What was the point of all this destruction? Her people, her commanders, they saw victory in this battle. But Circa had begun to question what victory really meant. As the battle raged on, Circa's eyes scanned the battlefield, searching for any sign of Jackson. She had heard rumors that the human soldiers were planning to make a final stand in this very area. They were preparing for a last-ditch effort to hold off the Zelthar, and then she saw him. Jackson was standing near the front lines, leading a group of human soldiers. His face was calm, his posture unwavering even as the Zelthar forces closed in. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was a warrior. He fought alongside his people, his eyes focused, his every move filled with purpose. Circa felt a surge of something, admiration perhaps. She couldn't help but respect him. He was everything the Zelthar had underestimated, everything they had believed humans were not. And yet, there he was, standing strong, ready to fight until the very end. Without thinking, Circa moved towards him. She had to see this for herself. She had to know if what she had seen before, the way he had healed, was truly a sign of something greater, something she had completely misjudged. "Jackson!" Circa called out as she approached him, her voice cutting through the noise of battle. Jackson turned his head at the sound of her voice. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment the chaos of the battlefield seemed to disappear. His gaze softened when he saw her, though he didn't speak. "We don't have much time," Circa said, her voice urgent. "You need to leave. This battle, it's too dangerous." Jackson shook his head, his expression unwavering. "I'm not running away," he said firmly. "We fight. That's what we do." Circa's heart pounded in her chest. He wasn't backing down. Despite everything, despite the overwhelming odds, he wasn't afraid. And for the first time, Circa found herself questioning everything she had known about this war, about the humans, and about herself. "You can't win this," Circa said, her voice filled with frustration. "Your forces are too small. You're outmatched. Please just let us take you out of here." Jackson's eyes darkened, but he stood his ground. "You don't understand, do you? We're not fighting to win. We're fighting for something greater than that. We're fighting for each other. We're fighting for our future." Circa's breath caught in her throat. She had heard those words before, but she had never truly understood what they meant. She had been taught to fight for power, for dominance, for victory. But Jackson, he fought for something else. He fought for his people, for their right to live, to exist. For the first time, Circa felt a spark of understanding. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about survival, about standing up for what you believed in no matter the cost. This was what the humans had been doing all along. They had been fighting for their lives, for their freedom, and for the chance to live on their own terms. The sound of an explosion shook Circa from her thoughts, and she looked around, realizing the battle had escalated. The humans were holding their ground, but their numbers were dwindling. It wouldn't be long before the Zelthar would overrun them completely. "I can't stop this," Circa whispered, "but I can't be part of it anymore." Jackson looked at her, his expression softening. "Then fight for what you believe in. It's not too late to change." With those words, Circa turned and ran toward the front lines, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had just realized. She had always fought for her people, for her commanders, for the Zelthar. But now, she understood what she had to do. The war wasn't over yet, but it was time to make a choice. The roar of the battlefield echoed in Circa's ears as she charged forward. The fight was chaos, blasts of energy lighting up the sky, soldiers screaming in the distance, and the sound of weapons clashing. But despite the overwhelming noise and confusion, Circa's mind was clear. For the first time in her life, she knew exactly what she had to do. Jackson's words had hit her hard. Fight for what you believe in. She had spent so much of her life fighting for someone else's beliefs, for a cause that was no longer hers. Now, everything had changed. She was no longer a soldier of the Zelthar. She was fighting for something bigger, something she had only just begun to understand. She moved swiftly through the battlefield, her heart pounding in her chest. The Zelthar soldiers were everywhere, focused on taking down the human resistance, not realizing that one of their own was about to make the most dangerous decision of her life. As Circa approached the front lines, she spotted Jackson again. He was leading his people, standing strong in the face of impossible odds, directing his soldiers with a calmness that seemed to radiate from within him. He was everything Circa had come to admire, steadfast, unyielding, and determined. Her heart ached as she watched him, the realization settling in her mind. She had been wrong. The humans were not weak. They were resilient, capable of so much more than she had ever imagined. And now she wanted to help them. She wanted to stand beside them, to fight for their survival. Circa found herself at the front of the line, her weapon raised, ready to face the enemy. She had always been a warrior, but now she was fighting for something she truly believed in. She wasn't fighting to crush the humans. She was fighting to give them a chance at life, a chance to protect what they held dear. Jackson turned his head as Circa approached, his expression unreadable. For a moment, their eyes met, and there was a silent understanding between them. She didn't need to say anything. He could see it in her eyes. She was with him. She was fighting for the humans now, just as he had always fought for them. "Are you sure about this?" Jackson asked, his voice calm but tinged with concern. Circa nodded, her jaw set with determination. "I'm sure. It's time for a new beginning." Without another word, they joined forces, their movements synchronized as they fought side by side. The humans and Zelthar soldiers locked in battle, but this time it was different. Circa wasn't just fighting for victory. She was fighting for a future, one where both humans and aliens could coexist, one where strength wasn't measured by the power of a weapon, but by the will to protect and survive. The battle raged on for hours, and Circa found herself fighting harder than she ever had before. She was no longer just a soldier. She was a protector, a defender of those who had been misunderstood and underestimated. She fought alongside the humans, showing them that she was no longer their enemy. As the tide of battle began to turn, Circa saw Kor, her former commander, leading the charge against the human forces. He was fierce, determined, and ruthless. He saw Circa fighting with the humans, and his eyes widened in disbelief. For a moment he stopped, as if trying to process what he was seeing. "Circa!" Kor shouted, his voice filled with fury. "What are you doing? You're one of us!" Circa's eyes met his, and for the first time she didn't feel fear or hesitation. She felt something else, clarity. She had made her choice. "I was wrong," Circa said, her voice firm and unwavering. "I'm no longer one of you. I'm with them now." Kor's face twisted in anger, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, perhaps regret, perhaps disbelief. He couldn't understand. To him, loyalty to the Zelthar was everything, but to Circa, loyalty to what was right had become everything. The battle continued, but now it was clear who was winning. The Zelthar forces, thrown into disarray by Circa's defection and the humans' unyielding resolve, began to retreat. The human resistance, once on the verge of being wiped out, was now gaining ground. Circa fought harder than she ever had before, determined to see this through to the end. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for a future where humans and aliens could coexist, where strength wasn't defined by the ability to destroy, but by the courage to protect. As the last of the Zelthar soldiers withdrew, Circa stood alongside Jackson, watching as the human forces celebrated their victory. The humans had done it. Against all odds, they had survived. Jackson turned to her, a smile on his face, though it was tinged with exhaustion. "You did it," he said quietly. "You fought for us." Circa nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "No, we did it. Together." The sky above them was filled with the sounds of celebration, but Circa couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. This was just the beginning. The war wasn't over, but a new chapter had begun. A chapter where humans and aliens could work together, where strength was measured by the ability to protect, to survive, and to help others. As the celebrations continued, Circa knew that her journey was far from over. There would be challenges ahead, both for her and for the humans. But now, she had a purpose, something that was worth fighting for, and, for the first time in her life, Circa felt like she had finally found where she truly belonged.